Back. Thank you very much. Zvi Koenigsberg is here. The book is The Lost Temple of Israel. Zvi, we're talking about your visit to the site at Shiloh and how that apparently is the site in Mount Ebal predates it. So continue on.
Okay, so when I asked Professor Finkelstein on the morning of, afternoon actually, of October 14th, 1983, when did Shiloh begin to function as the central cultic site of Israel, he said 1150 BC, which coincided exactly with the time that our site ended. In other words, Shiloh replaced our site. Now, why, we don't know. Okay. But if we go again to Genesis 48 and we see Jacob crossing his arms and people looking for the explanation for 3,000 years, I think that bingo, we have found it, because what he did was symbolize, what this chapter does is symbolize the transfer of the central holy site of Israel from Mount Ebal, tribe of Manasseh, to Shiloh, tribe of Ephraim. Now, how do we know that that makes sense from another perspective? You go to the next chapter, chapter 49, verse 10, in the blessing to the son Judah, who's considered the most important son, it says, until the coming of Shiloh. In other words, Shiloh is an important factor within the blessings of Jacob, and we probably have here the explanation for the entire chapter, Genesis 48, which is a very big deal, because again, if I'm right, and there's a chance at least that I'm right, for the first time we have been able to put an historical context into any part of the patriarchal narrative. You know, there's a story, Abraham, and then there was Isaac, and there was Jacob, and all these wonderful paintings that Rembrandt made, by the way, a whole number of paintings on these dramatic biblical moments, which is why, of course, this was chosen by him to do. We figured out a timeline for this, which is very important, because if you don't deal with things in context, then you really don't understand very much of what you're talking about, or at least you have a limited sense of what you're talking about, and we won't elaborate on that any further. Now, what I'd like to talk about for a moment is the kind of people I consulted with. This is a project that you just heard began ages ago. Actually, it began in 1981, as I mentioned previously, which was the same year that Raiders of the Lost Ark came out with Indiana Jones, etc. But the coincidence is even greater, because if you go to the book of Joshua, chapter 8, verse 33, you see that the ark was actually present at this site.
Incredible. So the
Yes.
book, the Indiana Jones, of course, is the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant, I believe, in Egypt. And
No, they found it in that, at the end of the movie, it was all these millions of boxes, and it was supposed to be in one of those boxes or whatever. What really happened to it, if there was one, we have no idea. No one will ever know, but the coincidence here is great. And
there's rumors that it's in the basement of the Vatican, but that's another subject. But the point here is that your evidence indicates that the Ark of the Covenant, after Joshua's conquest of Canaan, rested and was observed at Mount Ebal. And
well, the Bible says it was there. Now
this is proof that it was there.
Proof. Now we're talking. Now we're talking a different kettle of fish entirely.
Okay.
And I'd like to quote Professor Mazar for all of those who get into the ideas of archaeology proving or disproving or whatever. It doesn't make a difference, because the Bible. I got very excited the first time I met Professor Mazar, and I said, basically what you're saying, isn't this wonderful? You can prove the Bible. And he told me something I will never forget, and I hope all of you remember. He said, the Bible doesn't have to be proven. The Bible stands on its own, and its values are there. What archaeology helps us do is understand the Bible, which we have yet to be able to do to this very day, despite people trying to do so for thousands of years. We don't yet understand everything that we're reading there.
So then this basically fills in some of the blanks with regard to how to read this particular chapter.
That's a
in the
very good
Bible.
way to put it.
All right. And you've been working on this for decades, as you say. First of all, is Mount Ebal today accessible to archaeological research?
No. Bottom line,
It's
no.
not.
It's in a very difficult area, difficult to access from
For
a lot
political
of,
reasons.
mostly for political reasons.
Okay.
And to get to the site, actually, the short way is through a top secret military base, which is on top of the mountain, and nobody wants to let you go through there. But there are
Not so
pictures.
top secret anymore.
Well, no, everyone
I
knows
know,
it's there. It's visible.
The other thing is that after you did this research, over the more recent years, there's been a number of important people who are now looking at this research and beginning to see
Yes.
that it's something that is increasingly of value.
Well,
Talk
I'd like
about
to
that.
tell you a number of stories that are related to the development of this. One was Mazar at the time, Professor Mazar. I gave him the idea that the correlation between what we found and the biblical text was so exact as to make it very likely that at least the chapter we're talking about, chapter 27, had to have been written by someone who actually saw the site when it was active. Now, this goes so against the grain of accepted scientific opinion today, which dates these materials to many, many hundreds of years later. Now, he sent me at the time to a professor roughly of my age to ascertain whether or not this chapter is an anomaly in the book of Deuteronomy or it's part and parcel of the whole book, which is considered mainly one unified literary source. And this professor's name is Yair Zakovich, who eventually became a Dean of Humanities at the Hebrew University, and considered, if not the top, one of the top Bible experts in Israel. And he told me at the time, and this is about 30 years ago, that, yeah, he thinks 27 is part of the whole book. In other words, the whole book was written many, many years earlier.
Right.
Now, 12 years ago, I met Professor Zakovich. He came to Boston and he gave a lecture, and I went up afterwards, introduced myself. And I don't know if he didn't remember that we had met ages earlier. And I said, listen, I wrote something on this, and I'd like you to read it. And he said, sure. And I sent it to him with a friend. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting, waiting. And 15 months later, I get an email. He said, listen, I apologize profusely, but what I didn't know is that when he was visiting Boston, he was actually in San Francisco for a 2-year sabbatical, and just didn't see what was on his desk in Jerusalem at the time, where a friend of mine had brought it. So he said, give me a few weeks, and 3 weeks later I get an email, and he says, listen, this is my home number, this is my office number. When you're in Israel next time, call me. A month later I was there, I called him, we met, and I asked him, what do you think of point A, B, C, D? And he said, you know what, this is very interesting, and next time you come, you're going to prepare a lecture and give it in my class, which I did 6 months later, which was very enlightening for all sorts of reasons. And we've remained very friendly to this day. And he wrote a very nice comment review, which is on the back of the book. Now, in addition to him, Mazar at the time said, listen, one day you have to meet Professor Frank Morse of Harvard. They were very good friends.
Right. Now he's the chair of.
He's passed away a few years already.
Okay.
And he was the most noted Bible scholar at Harvard, and probably in the United States, was a big expert on epigraphics, on ancient writings of the entire ancient Near East. And I was fortunate enough to be introduced to him, spent many hours speaking about this thing. And he sent me an email, part of which is on the back of the book as well, giving his agreement to my major premise of the antiquity of the text versus the legitimacy of the find as well.
Now, more recently, there's been a Harvard professor of religion, and also a former Israeli prime minister has taken interest.
Well, there was a former prime minister, Ehud Barak, who came to the site actually, and Adam placed the Bible in his hands and told him, listen, read this text of chapter 27. And this guy, who was a pretty tough guy, is commander of, he was commander-in-chief of the Israeli army at the time.
Right.
And he was also head of Israel's most important reconnaissance group, like the equivalent of Navy SEALs, basically. His hands were shaking.
Because it was incredible what he was saying.
You don't go to this site
right.
and look at this and read this stuff without your hands shaking.
It's incredible.
Yes. So the successor of Frank Malkros, Peter Machinist, who is currently at Harvard, also gave me a very nice review a few weeks ago, and is also someone I've consulted with for many hours discussing these things, and they take it seriously, which to me is just wonderful. I mean, it's...
So it's a building situation with regard to it emerging as a story that is being more legitimized in the eyes of scholars of temple times.
At least you can say that some of the most important people who deal with these kind of things think that if not completely on the money, that I'm saying something that has to be reckoned with in understanding this whole range of subjects relating to ancient Israel's temples, etc. But I did not write the book in a style that's ordinarily reserved for academia.
Right, it's a popular book.
But I wrote it as a story, and just like I'm telling it now.
And also the subject matter can be a bit of a political hot potato. Not that, putting aside the archaeology, and that is that it further legitimizes the Jewish claim to Israel by actually
there is nothing
providing
that
evidence
has been found to date that comes anywhere near this in legitimizing that claim.
Incredible.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing, because this puts the people of Israel with an advanced cultic site at a stage where no one thought that anything like this could have existed from an academic, scientific perspective. Now, from a traditional religious perspective, this also presents some difficulties because the site per se is not described as the site of a temple. So this is something that works against everything. And
so you have people that are, there's political and religious ramifications for
and
this.
I don't know if anybody would like these conclusions, but I don't care if people like the conclusions.
Well, you're just trying to tell the truth. You're looking at these.
Well, the truth as I see
here
it, and the last person to write something on the back of my book, his name is Sami Michael. He's nominated now for a Nobel Prize in Literature. He's written many books translated into 17 different languages. And he says it's a great story, which it is.
Yeah. And also, I think it's safe to say that as the years continue in Israel and as archaeology continues in Israel, there is more and more evidence emerging to correspond, not that it needs to be done, but it corresponds with the biblical narrative. And I think it should, on the surface of it, the Bible should be taken as seriously as a historical document as anything that the ancient Greeks wrote or as anything that other groups wrote.
Well, now we're getting into a dicey situation where if you open up and say this is a legitimate historical document, then you have to say that the world is 57 or something, 100 years old, which is something that is incompatible
that's another
with.
subject. But
No, but it's all part and parcel of the same thing, because the fundamentalist religion looks at all of these things as
literal.
100% true and God-given and all that. And you can be a believer, but not necessarily go to that extent to understand that the writings of many of these materials were done by people, even if you believe that God was whispering in their ear, and people make mistakes.
That's right, and in a sense, you're saying that the story of Jacob blessing the two sons is one that was influenced by politics, possibly, in that because Manasseh was passed over.
I think more than that. I think it was created because of politics. Now, the big question that we don't have an answer to is why they moved from north to south. And that we do know why they moved from Shiloh, because the Philistines just, rampaged, destroyed Shiloh.
And then David created the city of David.
Right.
And that's where it was decided.
Well, there are people who disagree with that too. And, the funny thing is that there are a lot of difficulties here that during the course of my research, some of these difficulties have been falling away, but not because of what I've been doing, because of other things, like the writing, Hebrew writings. I attended a lecture about a decade ago at the Harvard Semitic Museum. There was a well-known professor from Israel who came and said, well, there's no chance that anything biblical was written before the 9th century. No Hebrew writing then. And then comes a discovery at a place called Tel Kiafa, where you see things 100 years earlier. So this is like a moving target.
Even the Dead Sea Scrolls show writing, or Aramaic writing.
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls is something else, because by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were around, this was more or less, there was an established, at least, Pentateuch, roughly. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I researched that as well. A good friend of mine at the Hebrew University, Professor Shalom Paul, he's the president of the Dead Sea Scroll Research Institute. So he sent me to the people who dealt with the Dead Sea Scrolls of Deuteronomy to make sure that the Dead Sea Scroll version matches up to the Masoretic, the traditional version that I was using, as a reference point to compare to the archaeology, and it all matched up.
It did.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But in the overall sense, regardless of what happened politically, regardless of the theological questions, the spiritual questions, this research does put, as the Israelis like to say, facts on the ground. I mean, it's your research and the research of other archaeologists, as they dig further and as they look at these things further, they are uncovering more evidence that is scientifically valid.
That's a very fair statement. Yeah. Not only that, there's recently, and coming to your neighborhood as we speak, there's something called Temple Mount Sifting Project. Long story, but the Arab religious body, the Waqf, cleared entire areas underneath the Temple Mount and brought it to a junk pile, basically. And these Israeli archaeologists went and began sifting through all the junk, and through a terrible process, a difficult work doing that, and they managed to come up with astonishing results. And they're on a tour now, actually, this month and next, showing that in different places. And if you look it up, Temple Mount Sifting Project on the web, you'll find them easily and see where they're appearing and talking. And it's really a fascinating subject. And they found evidence of first temple of Solomon, which is so rare, very rare,
yeah.
and has never been found before in that particular vicinity. And they found evidence of it, and that's just fascinating.
And that's an ongoing project, right?
That's an ongoing project. And they're coming here because they're looking for funds just to publish all of this, which is a very, very important thing, because this has been an ongoing nonsense, basically, of point of argument with the Palestinians, quote unquote, as to the historical legitimacy of Israel and especially of Jerusalem. And this stuff...
Well, that's why I was implying it's a hot potato. because
Yes.
it legitimizes the Jewish
Oh, yeah,
presence
no,
in
this
the
is
land.
what they did and what I
Yeah.
did. There's no question that it flies in the face of their arguments. Very simple.
Right, right. Well, their argument is that the Palestinians were there 2,000 years ago, and they probably were there, but they were probably Jewish.
That's a very complex issue, and we have some of the answers, not all of them, but
Right.
very few were Jewish. If you look at the historical evidence of the past few hundred years, the overwhelming number of quote-unquote Palestinians came to Israel in the beginning of the 20th century,
Sure.
the end of the
Most-
19th, because the land was being
work,
developed
yeah,
for the
that's right.
first time in 2,000 years.
No, that's right. I mean, it should be understood that with the increase of
They were like Arab Zionists.
the increase of Jewish settlement in the late 19th century, you had an increase of Arab settlement
That's exactly
who
right.
came for the economic opportunities that the Jewish settlers were bringing.
That is precisely correct.
So, but I mean, I'm saying for the Palestinians that can trace their ancestry back, they may have been Hebrews back
Well,
then.
there were some caves found in the area of Hebron with indentations on the right side of the entrance, which were for the Jewish mezuzah, which was placed there at the entrance of every house. So we know that these people originally were Jewish at one time.
Sure. And also there's evidence that the Temple Mount, the mosque on top, the gold-domed mosque, was actually possibly a synagogue. And it was built by the second imam who invited the Jews back into Jerusalem after they'd been driven out by the Byzantines.
Oh, that I haven't heard.
That's another story for
Another
another
story.
day.
Oh, plenty
But
of
there's a
stories.
lot of interesting things coming out. Anyways, Zvi, so I want to thank you for joining me. Your book is The Lost Temple of Israel. It's available at Amazon, amazon.com.
Yep.
It's just a sensational read. It's as you say, it's your story. You talk about how you got into this. You lay out the evidence. It's a beautiful book.
I thank you very much, Chuck. It's been a pleasure.
And you're doing, the thing I admire is that you stuck with it all this time and that you're just putting it out there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So.
The Sultan. The Sultan.